Hi, my name is Peter Middlebrook. I'm an international diplomat, economist, and investment advisor working with governments across the world. I'm also a private businessman as well. We're also producing, out of one of our startup companies in the United States, affordable housing for the homeless, in addition to many other things that we're doing. I'm a vegan for 30 years, 4 kids, family person at the center of all of it. I live here in Dubai, travel probably too much, but very actively involved in supporting the multilateral order and solving some of the more complex issues of our time. Delighted to be here with Tariq Qureshi, a voice of many of the future and one of the strident leaders here in the Middle East, projecting a voice out, trying to give a message to the world about the future.
What an absolute honor to welcome Dr. Peter Middlebrook in our little studio today. He is a quintessential diplomat. He is an international traveler, an explorer. Columbus would be shy in terms of the kind of stuff Peter gets up to. And he's crisscrossing the world, looking at a lot of developing part of the world, which we'll talk about today, and how his work is impacting everybody's life on a day-to-day basis. He is one of those unsung quiet heroes in the background who come and deliver large projects.
So very kind.
And today we're so happy to have him on board on the Voices of the Future, because he does genuinely have a great voice for the future. Peter, welcome. Good to see you, buddy.
My pleasure. Really, thanks so much, indeed, for having me. I appreciate it.
It's an absolute honor, and you know, we're buddies, we're mates, but more than that, I have held you in absolute high esteem since the first day I met you. So
likewise, we share very similar ideals, I believe. Yeah.
Indeed, and I think our sort of value alignment has sort of kept us together as friends, and long may it continue.
It will.
Peter, tell us about the early days of your life, young Peter, the 16-year-old Peter who was a rebel, who was a musician, who was basically saying no to everything. Because I think we need to have the context of a person like that becoming who you are today.
It's a good question. I think in discovering myself, it didn't happen through society or education. It happened for me deciding to make some decisions about what I wanted and probably running against the grain. So when I was young at school, I was the head boy in my school. I was the head of the football team, the rugby team, the athletics team. But I was lousy at formal education because I loved some of the teachers, but I didn't like the lessons. I knew I wasn't going to become a mathematician, and I realized there would be better people out there and we could outsource it to them and to do that. My life really changed when probably when I was 15, I believe. I was enjoying life as a musician. I kind of married into a kind of musical family. And I was at the stage of playing into larger audience, so the kind of lift-off phase of that. Mm-hmm. And very simple for me, I saw a BBC interview of the famine in Ethiopia when I was 15. And I said to my mother, with a tear streaming down my face, I said to my mother, "Where is that?" She said, "It's Ethiopia." And I said, "I'm going to go there and try and help." And I ended up living there for 7 years, helping them write their economic policy. And that was the first moment in my life. And then I went traveling. I traveled 100 countries very, very quickly, learning, just reading everything rapaciously, right? And that was the first moment in our life that I realized your life has to be in the service of other ideals or in other people. And a musical life was a different thing. Mm-hmm. It was very much about that. So that was kind of beginning foundations, I guess. And from that, I traveled and I experienced the world.
So you disrupted our routine education system. You basically rebelled against it and traveled, and I think travel is a great learning form. How did you get back into it? Because a lot of people sort of fade away and then never get back in.
There's this it's slightly crude British phrase: you're either inside the tent pissing out or outside the tent pissing in. I remember when I was in India and working in a wildlife park voluntarily. And I had no understanding of a formal education system. I said to the head of the park, "How did you get into this?" And he said, "Well, I did an undergrad in environmental science." I thought, well, maybe I'm going to have to go back and do some of this. But I have to say the PhD that I got a first-class honours degree in the UK. I did a PhD. Those were the easiest things of my life. They were. So I read a book called by Ivan Illich many years ago called Deschooling Society. And it was predicated on the assumption that a lot of our best educationists will tell you about. Which is that the first public education systems were established by philanthropists, industrial philanthropists. Mm-hmm. And they wanted chemists and physicists and mathematicians to go in like a production process and to come out to serve the industrial process. And that made good sense for the Industrial Revolution that was occurring in the West at that time. Of course, we then outsourced the Industrial Revolution. And there's been lots of structural changes, and the education system has not changed that much. So if you look in the West at the moment, most people, first of all, you do not need to be educated or to be smart. You do not need to go to school or to university. It could be useful. It could be if you have great teachers and a great peer group, but it's certainly not necessary. And in the days when I went to school, as you probably remember, when I first went to university, you had these little microfiches with all the newspaper headlines. And you had to go and research everything and anything, thousands of hours just learning stuff. And in those days, you had to know stuff. You had to be a subject matter expert in your field. That is no longer true. Now you need to know which question to ask. And the system does it for you. This has happened very, very quickly. So,
I've been talking about the art of questioning, the power of listening, the magic of storytelling as some of the new leadership traits that we need to have. And I enjoyed when ChatGPT blew up earlier this year, and everybody was asking questions and prompting and so on. I said, folks, I had been talking about this for the last 5 or 6 years, and you thought I was just, just being soft and fluffy. The art of questioning and curiosity and that sort of inner creativity, what do we need to do to keep that alive within us and within our children and within our environment? Because we're just getting so numbed with information.
So then you go back, I mean, you're the ultimate futurist because you care to dream how it might be. And for anyone who's collecting pixels from the big picture and drawing them together into a narrative saying, well, this appears to be what's happening. And it's very clear, we are in a digital age and we're still part of the beginning of that digital revolution, but the digital revolution is going to transform everything, certainly education systems, healthcare, energy, informational asymmetries on markets, I mean, everything which is going to happen there. Well, I believe that a lot of responsibility, the first thing as a parent, I know having 4 kids, as a parent, I've never outsourced my education to a school. I've never thought about it that way. We've educated our kids by not answering questions or by posing other questions, but by creating a sense of passion within them to explore and to dig. Now, do our education systems do that? Well, they don't, unfortunately. I do. I mean, some do. But education, as Einstein said, right, learning is basically comes from experience. So are schools experiential-based learning? Well, they can be in tertiary education, but certainly in preschool, primary, secondary, they're not. And you come back to this, I think, where's the educationist? The brilliant guy. But anyway, that all young kids preschool show signs of genius. They all show signs of being able to think differently about something. And if you agree that all children are suffering from a disease called childhood, and what that means is because they're small and they have to learn a new language, they're not respected, but they are brilliant in the next generation. So the question is this about the education system, is whether it's really about learning. What is learning for? What society do we want to bring about? Do we want to select brilliant people? What happens if all people can be brilliant? How does a society look when we get like that? Because that's not the model that we have at the moment. So I don't know. I think the AI ChatGPT, it allows direct individual curiosity into the ecosystem of knowledge in a different way than we've ever had. So, and this is why I think it's called democratizing education. I think it democratizes education. It democratizes knowledge, traditional knowledge for other people as well. So maybe the technology will collapse those asymmetries which have existed and allow more geniuses to.
Yeah, I mean, generative AI and ChatGPT, as I see it, it could be the end of search, it could be the end of advertising as we know it, it could be the end of news, perhaps even recommendation engines and so on, because we'll have a virtual assistant that'll answer all of the questions. These are 4 massive global multi-billion-dollar industries.
They are.
When these things shift, and particularly I would go into the media business and the news business because that hacks our brain and controls our thinking and the narrative that we have. How do you see this shaping in the next 1 or 2 years?
So let's just back up a bit. The word artificial intelligence implies that it's not humans that created it. Artificial intelligence is us in the collective. There's some brilliant people who've brought it into the marketplace. But it's essentially human. It's a summation of human knowledge. but it's a system that allows you to be able to go through it very quickly and make either inductive or deductive, reasoning out of it. And that's a very, very powerful thing. So let's step back even further. So religious states, nation states. I know you and I often talk about this.
Yes.
Really, really important, because this is what's coming about. We're going from governments to governance, and that's not a change in vocabulary. It's a fundamental shift in the social contract and the way social cohesion operates, in all countries and in all places. So the old model was of the nation state were these three states: the first estate, second estate, and third estate, which was the aristocracy, the clergy, and everybody else. And then the fourth estate emerged, which was programming, TV, and so forth. And then the fifth estate emerged, and that's the social media part. And social media was challenging programming, and you saw this with WikiLeaks. Oh, that's what you're being told. Perhaps there's another way of thinking about this. Now, the fifth estate is now where most of the informational media transactions take place. Even my daughter, right, she makes a good amount of money. She's reached out to hundreds of thousands of people and now sells diet-related stuff in a way that she couldn't have done. Before, she would have had to place advertising in, some formal fourth estate media outlet. So this has created a great, almost a frictionless, if you like, a frictionless world for information. Lots of issues on what is the truth and the quality of this information. But one has to assume that the AI revolution, as we talked about, we are just at the very, very beginning.
Yes.
So we have absolutely no idea, we may think about it, what's going to come in 10 years' time or 20 years' time. We are like the first, the Wright brothers aircraft. That's what this is. And already it's spurned so quickly. I mean, I have stopped using Google for the last 3 months. And I was one of those who saw Google as essential for my life. And who am I in any of this? But let's assume this is happening in the aggregate. So it's the ultimate disruption, I believe, to all systems, to governance. And it comes down to, it all moves towards the fact that your phone, which will be your bank, which will be your healthcare provider, which will track your healthcare, will track your security, will do your immigration as your QR code, that is the form of governance, which doesn't have boundaries. It's not a nation state. So all being disruptive, but we're still human, we're still you, still having coffee, still having conversations.
Indeed. You are a consummate traveler. You're sort of a cross between Ibn Battuta and Marco Polo in the modern shape.
You're so very kind, and I get none of the credit for that. I don't have shopping malls named after me. That's definitely true. But
you probably should.
Well,
and I always call you James Bond because you're here landing here.
Since
going
you told
there.
me that, I start to feel a little bit like James Bond, but I'm joking, obviously. Yes, but sure.
Tell us about your diplomatic years and what were you doing and anything interesting and exciting from those days.
Well, I mean, thanks for the question. I've traveled, I guess, the largest part of the world. My carbon footprint is terrible. And I justify that. For example, in the last couple of years, last 2 years, I put together the sustainable financing strategies for countries like the whole of Indonesia, for Malaysia, for Egypt, for Botswana, for a number of the Central Asian states, the Western Balkans, and others as well. So that's shaping the way trillions of dollars is transacted towards this kind of green transition. I've been through 18 countries this year, and it's been a slightly slower year for me doing this. But I'm the ultimate kind of globalist in the sense that I believe most of our problems cannot necessarily be solved only locally. There's this balance between this, as we talk about this hyper-global, hyper-local future, where everything in the middle is kind of being stripped out. Governments could be a fraction of what they are. So I'm very actively involved in that space, working with the United Nations, with the World Bank, with the European Union on their Global Gateway project, but advising governments on how they manage the transition over the next 20 years. And let's just take one part of that. We do a lot of economic work on the digital transformation or digitizing services. We're just putting a new modernization plan together for Lebanon, for example, as one country. So we try and work with governments on fixing deep structural problems and using the problems as an opportunity, as a springboard, a lighthouse, if you like, to saying, well, 3, 4, 5 years' time, it could look like this, but this is how we're going to get there. We have to go back into it. And then it's a sales game, right? Mm-hmm. How do you create compelling arguments that people believe that this is the only direction that you need to go? Do you need a voluntary carbon market, right? Do you need a green taxonomy? How would you invest in the digital space if the public sector doesn't have enough money to do it? How would you crowd in private capital? How would you incentivize it? How would you de-risk? So actively involved in this kind of game. So I guess it would be economic hitman sort of stuff, I think, in any conventional space. Mm-hmm. But we care deeply about what we do, and we do bring a lot of change. And the only negative thing for me is often the change is theoretical. We produce something, and 2 years later we go back, and there's tens of thousands of people doing what we had initiated. Mm-hmm. So it does have an impact, but like all these things, it's an act of faith, I believe.
Indeed. Let me challenge you on something. You mentioned 3 institutions that you work with, the IMF, the World Bank, European Union, mm-hmm. And I'll go beyond that, World Health Organization, and others. They were created 80, 90 years ago for problems that existed 80, 90 years ago, for issues that we had to address literally 2 generations ago. Are they relevant for today, and have they been able to transform themselves sufficiently? Because when I look at that from a distance, I'm saying, are they just big, sluggish organizations?
Two separate questions. I just flew in from New York. I was attending the high-level political forum, which takes place in July in New York. Mm-hmm. Well, yes, established on the back of the Second World War, the pivotal days of rethinking the global order from 1945 to 1947. Globalization, to a large extent, has been very successful in the sense that, and I always say this, every single international financial market works the way, every central bank works the way. Phones work in every country because we have standard ways of working. We do have common metrics on climate. We do have common metrics on poverty. We do have common metrics on the blue economy and a bunch of others as well. But the UN as an organization, I take the UN in particular. Well, the EU is a separate case because I've been working with the EU for many, many years. The UN, what would you replace it with? That's the first question. So we do need a global space for international diplomacy. Perhaps it's too Western-based historically. What's going on at the moment seems to be the collapse of the multilateral order that the West had put into place on the back of the First and Second World War. The non-aligned movement is becoming more powerful than the aligned movement. There's all the BRICS talking about de-dollarization. Yeah. And at some point, if the yuan becomes more dominant than the US dollar, of course, the IMF and World Bank will move to Beijing, and there'll be a 100-year switch. And you would expect that in the demographic nature of things as well. So the UN is essential. Some of the agencies, perhaps less essential than they were in the 1970s when the world was industrializing. Perhaps the world has changed a lot in all of that. Now, is the UN fit for purpose? Or are governments fit for purpose? Many of them not, I believe. There's this old phrase about being a self-licking lollipop, which is you produce something and consume it yourself. I think many institutions could be probably blamed for that. There's a huge push. I don't know whether you saw what happened about a month ago, which was this new international financial architecture, which has just been pushed out. And this has been pushed out. We were talking about with Jeff Sachs when we were in our discussions last week. So there is a move to renew it. The question is whether the pace of transformation which is taking place, whether the events are ahead of the analysis. And I think that is the risk. And by the way, bringing all members of the United Nations up to speed into the future is not an easy task. Mm-hmm. It's not just the vision, right? Because somebody needs to finance it, and it was predominantly Western finance. So I think not. I think a great deal needs to be done, needs to be reinvented. It may have a different demographic footprint, but things like the Sustainable Development Goals, they may be seen as ideological, but go and challenge one of them. Go and have a look at the key performance indicators there and ask, should we or should we not be supporting these?
So looking at Sustainable Development Goals, and I think we'll stay on this topic for a little while, The Sustainable Development Goals, the governments don't have the money to actually deliver the Sustainable Development Goals. It's in private capital. How are we attracting that private capital and maybe even the underground capital, with criminal money that's floating around in the system and so on. Yeah. So how are governments going to really address SDGs without genuine private enterprise getting in?
So first of all, I think there's lots of issues with the SDGs. But the fact that you and I can have this conversation, and I know you're a particularly well-informed person, they established what was called the Addis Ababa Action Agenda in 2015, which was what was called FFD, Financing for Development, as part of what was called this F2F revolution, from funding to financing. And the old model was governments will collect revenue, they produce their budget, they have a fiscal or budget deficit, they mobilize debt to fill that, and that would be the basis of their expenditure programs. Now, if you had to do to meet digital transformation needs, for example, and it was far more money than you had. The old model was you just keep on spending slowly against that. In 20 years, you may get there. But what happens if you need to do it within 2 years? How would you bring that capital into this? So what came out of the Addis Agenda was what is called the INFS, these integrated national financing frameworks. And there are 89 countries in the world who have been through that. I led 12 of those exercises. So in Indonesia, which happens to be a pretty advanced economy, young people, very adaptive, very interesting, and very quick on thinking not about funding but financing ecosystems. They put in place a financing ecosystem that encourages private capital, either by providing guarantees, they could be state guarantees that de-risk the asset itself, or provided blended financing structures where you get not-for-profit funds with profit funds, this kind of capital stack, which again shifts the risks and rewards in favor of rewards over that. The world of public-private partnerships, you'll see in Saudi and other countries, they have pushed heavily into this, the whole PPP space as well. So the aim is to change the incentives, changes to tax regimes, de-risking, getting access to capital, creating these apex structures that de-risk on lending for commercial banks into SMEs and others as well. So a great deal is being done. The impact of it may appear to be slow. And if you look at the latest IMF costing, by the way, for the SDGs, most countries will not meet most of them until 2048, 2050, under the business as usual case. So I think the criticism is right. We know what needs to be done. The problem is, for example, in deepening capital markets, in deepening financial market, requires regulatory and policy reform. And in democracies, that means it needs to go through a parliament, right? Which is not as quick as other slightly more centralized autocratic systems that can recognize it and to move it forward. So a lot of progress, a lot of challenges. The pace has been slow, arguably. But as you say, and I think it's correct, unless we align private capital towards some of these and make it more transparent, we will fail. Yeah.
My thesis is that the rate at which technology exponentially is going up, and the rate of change is so rapid that regulations by definition cannot keep pace. So it'll always be lagging. So sure. I think that's one of the things we need to be able to look at. The second is what I call our immune system response. Human beings have immune systems, so anything comes from outside, we block it, a virus or something. Similarly, we have corporate immune systems, or in this case, institutional immune systems, where anything coming from outside that you come in, oh, well, we should be doing this, or we should bring crypto, or we should bring whatever. And the first thing is an immune system response, and basically say, no, can't be done, too expensive, too difficult, too this, too that. So that clicks in. And the third one is trust. And the lack of trust and the trust deficit in institutions at this point in time, it's probably at its highest. So when these three dynamics are taking place in terms of people blocking change, people not trusting the institutions, and the institutions being behind the curve, so therefore less relevant. How do we make them more modern? How do we make them more relatable?
What you just described is, the Chinese symbol for crisis is made up of two words. We thought it's danger and opportunity.
Absolutely.
This is a disruption which is taking place. If we don't trust the institutions, two things may have happened. Either the transparency and accountability may have fallen, or our intellectual acumen and curiosity over those standards might have been raised, shining a light on whether they are self-serving or they do serve a wider purpose. All of what you describe as problems, I welcome, because I think we should. There's nothing, if society doesn't see that the institutions that they finance through tax is representing them, that system is broken or breaking. And most likely that's true. For corporates, it's completely rational. So, here you are, you may, what's the old Reaganomics? The old Reaganomics, we talked about this, right? A part of an economy which is beginning to move, you might start to regulate it. If it continues to move, you would tax it, right? If it doesn't move, you'd subsidize it. And there's lots of green, energy space which is being subsidized to allow it to be able to move to make this alternative kind of come into the conventional space. But if you are one corporate there, the first thing you're going to do, and let's look at ESGs, these environmental, social, corporate governance goals. The first thing you're going to look is you're going to look left and right with all the competitors. Are they doing it? Because all of these things you're going to do will raise the cost of doing your business, like CSR. So how is that working? If other people are moving, you might start to move. The question is perhaps on time scale. Today looks a little bit like yesterday. Look out your window. If you stand back, if I'd come back to 30 years ago to now, the world has changed in all possible dimensions. Look at, one-stop shops. Online services through a phone, you can gain access to everything. Every day has just been chipping away at that. Well, at some stage, we won't need ministries in the same way. We won't need cabinets in the same way. It's what my good friend Piral Khanna talks about, technocracy. Could technocracies in part displace democracies?
Yes.
And if capitalism is eating democracy, right, which in part it appears to be, right,
Yes.
we are in this transitional process. Now, this becomes, I think, what we talk about, this hybrid reality, where you've got elements of an old order integrated with new elements that are not necessarily fully harmonious. And there's some cognitive dissonance which is caused around that. But if you believe in evolution, which I assume you do in some part,
Yes.
there's arguments against it. We can maybe touch on that in a moment. But anyway, if you do believe in that, then everything you describe is a necessary part of getting to a better stage.
Right.
Governments were about governance. And if we can get to governance more directly rather than having to go through governments at a lower cost, surely that's a good thing.
Okay. Let's look at AI and data and generative AI particularly. I call it a weapon of mass destruction in terms of how it can really...
Not a weapon of mass intelligence.
not intelligence destruction. So as a WMD, the last WMD that we sort of created was nuclear weapons or nuclear fission. And immediately everybody was running around trying to find ways for non-proliferation and treaties and governments coming together. There's nothing like that for data. There's nothing like that for AI that we visibly see. And therefore they're running amok. And basically our future's in the hands of people like Zuckerberg and Musk and Bezos. Really? Is that who's going to be deciding our future in terms of what we think, what we consume, what
question
we have?
Is it? So, let me ask you a question. You use like ChatGPT's equivalent, I assume.
Yes.
Why are you doing it? Because it's better than what existed before.
Indeed.
Sam Altman, for example, and Elon Musk, others, they certainly bought. What they did is, what they've built on was, what's happened, the systems which have been put in place the preceding 20 years. So, if you believe in not democracy, but I believe this transition towards direct democracy, right? Every day you're voting in how you spend.
Sure.
Right? You want to live in Dubai or Los Angeles. You're voting.
Yep.
Yeah, you want to have coffee, tea. I mean, these decisions are there. You want to use Google or you want to use some other large language. Well, these are choices. But there's been a flood of people into this. Sorry, because what it does is better. Google tells you everything which is out there. You can't ask questions in the same way. You then have to go into each one of those painfully. Here, that's going to do it for you. Now, all you have to do is ask better questions and by parenthesis and so forth. So now the question is, did they produce it? Yes, they were the people who brought it to the market and the people who had enough money to invest into it. But surely what they've done, it's a bit like if you buy a heater, right? You put it in. It's only possible because taxpayers pay for the entire electrical system the other end. This was only possible because of that. But people are using it because it makes sense and because it's better. Now, it will have implications. If you come back to the nuclear generation, that weapons of mass destruction in that conventional sense, that came on the back of the Second World War and what was going on in the Manhattan Project and Oppenheimer and whatever, and there was a specific context to that. Most likely there's a similar context to how this was born in that sense. One of the, what's called the 18th SDG is, you've probably heard about this.
No.
The 18th SDG is something which has been advocated by a number of universities, which comes to this point. The 18th SDG, 17th was, partnerships for the goals. 18th was, what about from space? Looking at ourselves as an organism. Mm-hmm. Right. Now, if you think about the way knowledge is in supercomputers, 50% of wildlife has disappeared in the last 70 years. Mm-hmm. Did we stop it? No?
No, not really.
Coke and Pepsi and other companies are advocating for the SDGs, but we're still producing single-use plastic. Have they changed? They have not. You can go through all of it. So the question is now, what comes out of this is, individually, we can't process that level of data and to give it meaning. Mm-hmm. So we are going to need supercomputers because it's so complicated to allow us to understand where the hell we're going. Are we on track? If we do set targets, are we meeting those policy goals? So probably, and I think we touched on this before, ChatGPT and others are being used because they have a great utility in people's lives. They instantly say, oh, this is better and we're going to do it. It will have implications. There's winners and losers, and that's been history. The second part of this is the questions which are being asked of these systems. And we've never been quite in that way. Mm-hmm. So you may find with supercomputers, now the question is who owns them?
Yes.
Who owns the algorithms? Yes. Who owns the conclusions, and how you democratize that? And then this goes back to Reaganomics. These are pre-market technologies which are pre-regulated. Regulations will come like with crypto, perhaps too late, but it will come, and it's a necessary growing pain, perhaps.
So let's.
I know I'm an optimist.
So am I. So sure. I think that's why this conversation is getting fairly abundant in its extremities. We've got a new healthcare system, more preventive rather than curative that we have, and because we have so much data, etc., we need a new learning and education system, as we discussed. We need a new financing system with crypto, digital currencies, and so on. How that sure. We have management of data. If we cannot manage and I wouldn't say use the word control, but at least channel it towards for human good,
greater public good,
for greater public good. So that's there. So to me, these are some of the big issues that are out there, and from a layman's point of view, and you're much closer, and you can see the dynamics of it at a helicopter level. Are you optimistic?
I'm optimistic on. I'll give you an example. So I'm the team leader on an exercise out of Brussels. It's a technical assistance facility helping the European Union on their Global Gateway Team Europe initiative, for example. I won't say much more about it than that. But in terms of the direction that institutions are setting and the awareness of issues, I believe that maybe a bit late, but we are moving towards a better direction. Having electric vehicles is better, but where does the electricity come from? How clean is that? I mean, you just keep on going through all these kind of questions. What I'm not optimistic about is that the institutions we have are those that will take it forward. And I can give you a really good example. I was in Lebanon a couple of weeks ago, and we've been asked to put together a new public sector modernization program because there isn't a government really at the moment, as you know. They know very well that the old model of providing services, 70s, 80s, 90s, and whatever, is irrelevant. You can go to Azerbaijan and you can see that all services are digitalized, or you can see them here and other places as well. But they don't have enough money to jump to that system. So how do they get there? So you can speak to a department that talks about digital transformation, and you'll say, how many computers do you have? And they'll say 3, and no one knows how to use them. Mm-hmm. So those systems have failed because they didn't meet their intended purpose. Now, to what extent could public goods be delivered also through private enterprises? An interesting space we're beginning to get into. Mm-hmm. So I'm not optimistic that our institutions are particularly good or fit for purpose. And they probably, by the time they've become institutionally aware that they're not fit for purpose, they may be moribund and may be taken out and may be replaced. I believe that probably to be necessary and probably to be good in the process, but it won't be orderly.
Yeah.
It won't be some conductor doing it, right? It's the same with governments in debt. Everyone's borrowing, the debt levels are going through the roof. We want to be sustainable and then let's go into debt to do it. It's an oxymoron, obviously. It's a paradox, right? It's one of the many paradoxes which are there. If you fast track 100 years forward, you probably have this hybrid reality where you get remnants of government which are fit for purpose as centers of excellence. You get this kind of corporate sphere, purely private, and then this kind of public-private corporate, sort of space as well. And then you'll get these kind of backwaters which are, remnants of the Middle Ages. So you're going to get, thousands of years old places that are dysfunctional. And then this is most likely what we're going to get into, sadly. But
yeah,
true.
I mean, I'm a bit concerned about big groups that can have a lot of money, that can lobby and control most outcomes. The healthcare sector is one of them. They have, 1,400 lobbyists in Washington, D.C. So two lobbyists per representative, and they basically, they can't do anything. I mean, so they're in control. So there's no incentive, no financial incentive for them to bring about any kind of real change in terms of preventive healthcare and so on.
That's correct. Yeah.
The insurance companies are in the way, then hospitals are not healthcare environments, they are more sick care environments, and big food and the food industrial complex drives that. So here's this big blob of things which I don't see in the foreseeable future to fundamentally change for our benefit. The second big area for me is the oil and gas sector. We've discussed tech already. The oil and gas sector has $4 to $5 trillion invested in under the ocean and under in their hard assets. They're not going to walk away from $5 trillion worth of assets. They're going to fight like hell and deny climate change and et cetera, et cetera. And this year has been the hottest year ever. In the history of since we've had records. And based on that, and still there is now this is happening and so on. Now, the oil companies and some of the research, say 50 years ago, 40 years ago, they knew that this was going to happen. In spite of that, they did it, and they used lobbying and infrastructure to make sure that nothing stops them from making tons and tons of money. And now we as people, as the average public, the taxpayer, is actually receiving all of that. And still we are funding them. To me, this is broken. How can we have healthcare and tech and oil companies?
That's maybe correct. So we were brought up on, it's not even probably a logical fallacy, it's probably false consciousness, that you get three models. You can be capitalist, you can be socialist, and you can be communist. And you can choose one of those. That was the simplicity. There's no such thing as a pure capitalist society. There's much more neoclassical libertarian in a place like the United States. But every economy is a hybrid. There's many economies that were Soviet until the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s. They still have Soviet, communist structures, elements within all of this. Arguably, capitalism and wealth creation has gone too far the opposite direction, in the sense that it may create great innovations, but it has these unintended consequences too. As we were saying, I was in Bosnia. We were actually hosting an event in New York, also with the Bosnian ambassador and others from the Western Balkans. And I was saying, how does it feel to have someone like Elon Musk? And I have nothing against Elon Musk. I think he's a brilliant guy. But how do you feel like having one person whose personal wealth is like 10,000% the GDP of your country? Well, the thing is, that's what's happened with this ideology. I think that ideology is going to be rolled back. China is still state capitalism. Not every government in the world operates in the same way as the United States may operate. And there's lots of issues we could probably dig into all of that. So I think you're right. There's no, and certainly on the healthcare side, the problem is the cost of preventive care is much higher than curative care.
Today.
Well, today, but it's the same way with energy. Alternative generation was higher until it becomes the new conventional.
Correct.
If you look at oil and gas, for example, oil and gas was part of our foreign policy because oil and gas was coming out of the Middle East. So if you want to control relative stability, there's the petrodollar there. Now, when you start deleveraging and say we can produce it at home, guess what? This Middle Eastern oil is going to go east, not west. And next thing you've got these BRICS talking about de-dollarizing. These are the consequences of that. So oil is not just about oil. It was about control. It was about stability. It was about industrialization. It was about all those other elements. So it could be, ironically, in a place like the West. And the way I think demographically about this, and this is quite interesting, you could probably say the last couple of hundred years have been a kind of the Western centuries, probably, I think, in real terms. If you take the United States and Canada and Europe and New Zealand and Australia, and this could be an expanded Europe to include Ukraine and Turkey, for example, that's only 10% of the population of the world. So the demographic shift has changed. Yeah. There's this pivot to Asia that's going on. Asia has a different approach to these things. So, I would fully, I'm not against lobbyists per se, but lobbyists that are only to do with financial self-interest obviously hurts an awful lot of people. But then that's a failure of our governments, right? Indeed. It's a failure of the political class and an electoral system that puts people in who have the credentials to have those kind of side brokerage deals on the side, right? Now, maybe we don't need to have elections in quite the same way. Maybe we don't. I don't know. So it's a difficult. It is what it is at the moment, and some of this will fall, thankfully.
This is the year of COP28, and our book Voices of the Future, and all of this is going to be rolled out in November. So climate, sustainability, etc., is extremely topical. There's a phrase that I use in my keynote presentation: is that green is the new digital. So we have to look at everything through green.
Sure.
And secondly, that sustainability has to be profitable. It should be our new profitable. So therefore, we are creative people as human beings, and we need to now rethink the sustainability is not a CSR project, but actually it's a profitable project. How do we make money through sustainability? And until we have that formula in our heads, I don't think we're going to have any kind of real sustainability.
So I'm sure that's true. I'll tell you a story. I don't know the mechanics of all of it, but I've been close enough to some of it. Around the time of the 91, 92 Earth Summit, and there was an awareness when the West started outsourcing the industrial capability to China and to other countries, that there was likely to be regulatory shortcomings there that would lead to impacts on the environment. The West outsourced its production there, and the environmental issues took place there. And Gro Harlem Brundtland was, I think, the Norwegian minister, produced a book called the Brundtland Report, which is the first time the word sustainable development had ever been used. And that was an awareness at the time that unchecked industrialization would negatively do probably pretty much what it's done. So in terms of making sustainability profitable, I would go further. There's lots of things we are going to do as a human species that we simply shouldn't be doing. And this is the do no harm principle. So this is caused by what Garrett Hardin called the tragedy of the commons. Tragedy of the commons described very, very simply as this. If you had a piece of land with 10 farmers on it, and it was sustainable when each farmer had one cow, and then one individual bought 2 cows on, that would be to the net benefit of that individual, but the net loss to the ecosystem would be attributed everywhere. This is a problem of public goods. So what we've been trying to do is to internalize these externalities. Now, if you were to look at the real cost on the environment of all the products that we use, most of them would not be at a price that are affordable. Now, if you do that, half of the practices that we have, for example, you go to Australia, you get some Perrier water. The cost of that Perrier water is not the water at all. It's the branding, it's the bottle, it's all of the delivery stuff that goes with it. It has nothing. Now, you could make sparkling water there that tastes very, very similar. Yeah. Do we need to do that? Do you need to take oil from the Middle East and ship it 7,000 miles to the United States? Perhaps we don't. So, yes, making sustainability profitable will certainly mean, if we're honest about that there are certain practices that we have which are unsustainable and need to stop. I'll give you an example of this. The climate change stuff is obviously, sadly, a complicated debate. I was looking the other day at the Exxon chart. It was very interesting, established by Exxon scientists in 1982. Yeah. 1982, they did a projection on carbon as a percentage of the atmosphere. Yeah. And they are absolutely smack on. And nothing has changed since 1982 in their projection. Exactly where we are is where they thought we were. So in 50 years, all of the positioning, nothing changed.
That was the report I was referring to.
Oh, right. So,
Yeah.
so you can see that. So this is the scientific question: is how honest we're being. Now, what happens if lobbyists stop you being honest because they want to make money out of lobbying?
Correct.
This is the interface. If capitalism starts to eat the truth, so we don't know where we are going to make bad judgments. Making something sustainable, it may not happen over the short term. Are we going to make adjustments and make it over the long term? I personally think there's bigger issues out there than carbon. Carbon is a huge issue, but the loss of our ecosystem, these hypoxic dead zones in the ocean where there's nothing, our resource use linked to capitalism. The more you consume, the more you're elevated in society. We don't rank a teacher, but if you're a football player, and I have nothing against football players, but you're great and you're just a teacher. All of these things have been based on metrics of that. So I think there's a lot that needs to change. And I believe that the religious books we have haven't been very helpful because they say that the world and everything started 2,500 years ago. If we're honest, and it seems to be the case, that the oldest human skull is at least 1 million. So our civilizations have risen and fallen many times because they failed, most likely. Most likely. We believe that we are the first great civilization. That's the arrogance of all of it. We may fail because we don't address these issues. In which case, that's just sadly a repeat of history. But I don't know, there's not very much sustainable about what we're doing at the moment. So it's going to take a major shock, COVID, something bigger, a major shock to force it, or a collapse which then forces a rethink. And we're perhaps somewhere in that space, I don't know.
If COVID had lasted another, say, couple of years and taken out another 100 million people, let's say, like the first Spanish flu, would the reset have been greater, better, and would we have learned more?
Sure. I mean, the great reset, as it was pushed by Schwab and others as well, there has not been a great reset. I think that's probably true.
Yeah.
I went on to, remember the report Government 2071, which came out at the World Government Summit here?
Yes.
It's no longer available online. Now, there could be different reasons for that. No particular reason about it. So, but, there is a need for a great reset. There is, absolutely. And it hasn't happened, I believe. It hasn't happened in this short moment. Are other pandemics coming? You can bet your bottom dollar that they will.
Yeah.
Will they catch people out? They will. Will it hurt more people than's just happened? Most likely it's true that it will. So this may not be an outlier. It was historically an outlier, but it may not be an outlier. Now, whether that just becomes one of the many exogenous shocks that is trying to wake up us as a species, perhaps it is.
Another interrelated and slightly complex question, and that is, you have technology and robotics creating potential unemployment, impacting the tax regime, and also perhaps universal basic income and creating digital twins. So these 3-4 elements together, I think they're sort of in the same space.
I agree.
What are your thoughts?
Well, first of all, who cares? I mean, it's in the sense that could we stop it if we wanted to?
Yeah.
Right? Can we stop Boston Mechanics producing police for the corner of a street? You can go up to these things and they fully wire with Google. It will tell you information on any. Are we going to stop this from happening? Most likely we won't.
Yeah.
Do the police? There's a lot of really good police out there, but do the police force generally, or in most countries, do a good job? Not necessarily. And you can see here, for example, this is a really important point. There's countries that invested in law and order, and then there's the West, which is investing in human rights. But human rights is not coming with law and order. I was just in New York, go to California. They're completely different things in all of this. So what happens if law and order is going to be built by some of these things? First of all, I think they're probably unstoppable. The effects of them will need to be regulated. For that to happen, we will need a different political class of people to think through what the implications of them are, like social media and bullying, for example. There's a huge issue. No one talks about it. It's not regulated in any way. So how do we regulate technologies that may have a profound impact on employment, on the tax base, on the social contract, and therefore on the tax base, on the way we deliver public goods? I don't know. Historically, we've seldom, well, I know that some of the oil companies did take innovations out because they wanted to maintain the inefficiency of the market to maintain that. But seldom, I think, in history has humanity taken an innovative product off because cognitively we knew it was going to lead to harm. Now, it may happen at some other point. I don't know. Let's assume, as you suggested, that for a sustainable economy to work, that the way we think about wealth creation, about jobs, needs to change. What is the poverty rate in India or Africa? Have the old systems helped that? How many people live on less than $10 a day in this world? 60% of the world?
Yeah.
Is $10 a day acceptable? Could you live on that? I couldn't.
I couldn't.
So the old system has not done a great job either. That's what I think. So,
It's interesting. It's a nice segue into that because I was going to ask whether you work for dirt poor countries like Sudan and South Sudan, and you work on projects there, and you've looked at all parts of Africa and then other parts of Asia and Central Asia. How do you reconcile to this extreme poverty in an environment of extreme abundance that we are creating? So there are these two polar opposites.
I fully agree. You can't. It can't be rationalized.
I cannot do that. Somehow the disparity.
Yes, exactly.
And you mentioned $10. In some cases, it's less than $2. While we're creating so much abundance. So if it's a question of redistribution of that abundance, and it could be through technology, what catalysts do we need? What kind of social contracts do we need to change to start doing that? Because I believe we create enough abundance for the whole world to live very, very happily, and a few people can be extra rich.
The question is, you probably remember this discussion on the Tobin tax, which was a tax on financial transactions, which, by the way, the financial industry would hardly feel. But a Tobin tax will probably allow the basis for a minimum set of transfers to the poorest people. And this is a question of how you identify, the media terrorist attack is a terrorist incident, but if you were a single mother with 3 kids living on the streets with no job, that's a terrifying experience. Mm-hmm. And there's so many people doing that. So we're in a paradoxical times where, as we say, where it's kind of unsustainable, but also unstoppable. We don't seem to be able to stop it. We know it's unsustainable, but we just seem to people going down that route. These extremes, I was just in Botswana. We've just put their new national investment strategy together. Mm-hmm. And now their new financing strategy. And they're in the same space, heavy investments, a diamond concession, which provides revenue, which has kept them very well as a kind of upper middle income country in Africa for some time. They've just struck a new deal. But, they're trying to think about what all these new elements, how do they fit within this economy? They can't invest into it very quickly. So it's a kind of slow process of all of this. This is where I think you'll end up with what the IMF calls this Twin Peaks scenario, which is, after Nord Stream, kind of Europe is secured for the United States in part. So you've got Europe, United States, perhaps some parts of South America, there's issues there. Then you've got what's going on around SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization in the East. And then you've got Africa, which is there. And the old adage, I've forgotten his name again. I've forgotten lots of people's names in this process. That's what happens when you become a practitioner in the field. But a picture of Africa and everyone around the dinner table. And Africa was on the plate. It wasn't on the dinner table. You've probably seen that. Africa is it's a living paradox. Where there's no governments, people are generally freer than they might be in other places, perhaps, but they don't get the benefits of public goods. There is investments in places like Kenya. There's some countries which are beginning to be quite, progressive in terms of, mobile payments and digital services and so forth. But you can't reconcile it. I think from a moral point of view, I think you can't. And that's why, you're optimist when you're young, and you become a pragmatic optimist as you get older.
And skeptical when you get even older.
Well, you become skeptical that it's solvable for a large number of people within your lifetime. And I think probably that's not. And that, sadly, is the human condition. And this period is not unique. Perhaps people are still better off now, perhaps at the cost of the environment, than we have ever been. So I don't know. It's not ideal, is it?
Let's bring about some more philosophical issues as we come towards the end of this fascinating conversation. I start all my presentations with, and I ask the question, and maybe I shall ask this rhetorical question to you. What do you think is going to be the single most important thing defining our future?
I guess there's many factors that come to our ability to be, for ingenuity, and to be honest about it. Are we honest about where we are? Mm-hmm. Right? Can we, through collective action, change things? Apparently not.
Yes.
For example, if bad example, I'm not picking on one. If a company like Coke or McDonald's, if no one went to McDonald's for 2 weeks because they complained about the packaging. You walk in, you get packaging, you throw it in a bin in 20 seconds and you walk straight out. If everyone just said we're not doing it anymore, they would change in a day.
Yeah.
So how do we get collective action that allow those things to happen? So somehow it's probably not just one thing, but that collective voice, if you like, that collective bargaining can probably determine the future, but only if there's a sense of social cohesion amongst what are now seen as kind of disparate groups, by sex, by race, by all these other horrible divisions which are being put out there.
Yeah.
So I guess collective action is probably going to be there, I would imagine.
In a very simplistic way, what I put forward is the word trust. The trust has always been at a premium. Now, even more so, do we trust our institutions? Do we trust technology? Do we trust all of the shifts and changes that are happening? So trust, very closely followed by truth and ethics. Actually, truth should define trust.
Sure.
And ethics and our sort of moral compass that we were talking about. And anything and everything that's going into technology at this point in time has to have some kind of ethical base, a moral center. Where do we get
That's very religious. Trust has no metrics. Mm-hmm. You can get a loving marriage of two people who trust each other, but they're both cheating.
Yeah.
You don't know that they're cheating.
Yeah.
Right? That could happen. It's certainly true of governments. It's true of corporations who are dumping stuff in oceans without. Those things are there. So trust can only be held up high based on metrics of transparency. How transparent is that you could, say this is exactly what it is that we did. Now, transparency requires human systems and third-party arbiters to come in and to shine a torch on it and say, well, we're independent from the process, and we're looking, and we can say independently that these are metrics of what they are. So, to getting trust requires, so much more. But one of the great things about technology is that it's codified and works the way that it does. Like many people will say, we make a phone call, who's listening? Well, perhaps if you're, espousing a particular ideology in a particular place, or you're going to run for politics, you may be on the map. But for someone who's serving croissants and coffee, they're probably not being watched by the state. It's unlikely that that's probably happening. So you can get a reasonable degree of trust in certain domains. But how to elevate trust and put metrics on it, and have independent systems, you then come back to the crisis of globalization, which was we had some of those ombudsman sort of structures. We had those nationally, but we don't have any of that oversight globally for global corporations at all.
But aren't we sort of now moving towards deglobalization and localization and trying to get back in a little bit, particularly post-COVID?
So the argument is that we've gone from offshoring to nearshoring, and we're shortening value chains and so forth, and that's as a result of the Ukraine crisis and other things is true. That may be true. Globalization is probably unstoppable. The question is whether the old model, I think I told you last time, a good friend of mine, Richard Pontio, who was the director of the Commission for Global Governance, and we looked under 2 or 3 years, a very large research project. We launched in The Hague and others. I was a key expert on that to look at what globalization might look like. And the surprise is that it's going to be a hybrid. It will strip out the middle. And you may find yourself that the best form of globalization is localization, right? In fact, they build from each other. So again, and we'll see how it's going to be defined. So for example, here, my experience in Dubai, you don't walk out, you don't see police on every street, and there's security. If you go to Pakistan, you will see police on every street and there's no security, right? So you've got all these kind of elements which are there. I don't know. I think it's well, we'll see where we get to and where the systems lie. But localization is going to be key. It's probably key to democracy. You know, your local people that you elect locally who will deliver something here and you can see it. That's probably where trust and transparency. And then that transition is a good thing. That just means that nation states will become less important, which of course is true. And that's a good thing, I believe.
And city-states will become...
well, if you've got 70% of the population living in 500 cities, that means the mayors and the mayoralties are perhaps the most important form of governance. And then there's the corporate space out there and the technology that you use for the interface for things. But is it more or less trustworthy? Again, you're comparing completely different systems, right? In all of this. My hunch would be that we are getting better systems, whoever owns them. Take Earthlink, Elon Musk, and just think about this as a country. You now don't need to build the entire land network across the country, which costs billions. You can just have direct access. That's a good thing, right?
Indeed it is.
Is it a good thing that a child with a smartphone who doesn't go to school can now learn directly? That's a good thing, I believe. Would it be a good thing, instead of being taught by a terrible math teacher, you took the 100 best math teachers in the world and everybody got access to them? Perhaps.
Indeed.
Winners and losers.
Winners and losers. And I have resisted the temptation, but I must ask the question about Ukraine.
Am I happy? Sure.
Yes, I will end with that.
Sure.
Ukraine is like the big elephant in the room. We're sort of ducking and weaving, and everybody's sort of trying to engage with it. What exactly is happening there? How do you see this thing opening up and clearing out?
I'm fairly sure I probably can't say too much about that. I think what I will say is that, again, the reason for the withdrawal from Afghanistan was because of what was going on in Ukraine and Europe. And the truth is that NATO can dominate Europe or it can dominate Central Asia, but it's unable to dominate both. And that story is fairly simple because of what happened in Afghanistan. You know, I lived there for 10 years, as you probably know. So Afghanistan, funding the Mujahideens to, take out the Russians in part. And then when the Soviet Union collapsed, everyone ran back in to consolidate Europe as it expanded because of that contraction. And it all started to spin out in Central Asia. So the Taliban came in to stop the Mujahideen. You've seen these things. So then there was a huge switch back out there to solve that and bring it. And then it starts to spin out here. So the situation in Ukraine, without talking specifically about one particular side, it's going to have a profound impact on history, because if you put sanctions on Russia, you force Russia to trade east.
Yes.
You force Russia to trade into SCO as this new bloc, which is the pivot to Asia, which is going on.
Yeah.
So it's obviously deeply sad what's going on there. And extremely regrettable. But it's in its historical context, it will be viewed as an event or events that took place that redefined international relations. I think that's true.
Do we see an end in sight?
To human conflict?
No, not to human conflict. To the conflict in Ukraine and Russia. Is there?
It's hard to see. It's hard to see any quick resolution.
Okay.
Because as much, in my view, it is territorial, but it's ideological conflict.
Yeah. And
ideological conflicts they run a long time, I believe.
Yeah.
The risk is that it widens, which I believe it probably could.
Yeah.
And at that point, what's the old saying about war? There's wars don't determine who is right, only who is left.
Yes.
And I think there's that. It will end up redefining Europe. It will redefine NATO. It will redefine SCO. Redefine the Middle East and other places as well. But it's not going to blow over tomorrow. I don't believe any African initiative is going to solve it. I don't believe any Chinese initiative is going to solve it. It will be with us for some time, regrettably.
We've got about 5 minutes to go. Is there anything that we have missed? Because I think we've covered a lot.
Philosophical outlook on life, and I just wanted to touch on this.
Sure.
For me, most of our lives are exogenous. Everything's happened outside us. The software you run, the philosophy you run in your head, allows you to view the world as it is, and allows you to know the rules of the game and to engage that. And the more you know about power structures, the way the economy works, the more knowledge you have, the greater you are perhaps to be a player in that system, in all of it. But philosophical outlook, I think, and the spiritual part of it, I think, is something which the industrial West, and I'm not suggesting there isn't spirituality in the West, you'll see it in music and dance and art and other places, but it's frozen out of the economic space. So I would welcome, and I believe this to be part of the green sustainable revolution, not any particular political model, but a new social way of understanding who we are, our purpose in life. And as I describe to my kids, I believe this to be an important story, and it comes back to the ethics and morality around this. And I think you and I have discussed this before. When you sit down and you get a plate of food and there's rice on that plate, that is not rice. That started by people somewhere in a paddy field, mostly women and girls, backbreaking, taking credit, and that rice gets taken and put on the corner. And then someone collects that and drives it here, and then it goes to a port, someone releases it. People spend 4 months on a ship, someone releases it again, someone picks it up, right the way to a cook. And all of those people you will never meet. And you will never have that rice if it wasn't for them. How much do you give back to them from that? So I believe this is the thing about education. Our education system, you could restructure it in entirety. It doesn't talk about work-life balance, tells you nothing about marriage, tells you nothing about playing international markets and financing, doesn't tell you anything particularly about moral philosophy. So that element, I think, has to be part of it. And you'll see it starting to come here in certain places like in Dubai, but it's certainly not widespread. So, yeah, I believe that element to be important.
So do you think we are leaving a better place for our children in terms of the future, and what do we need to do today to be able to...
Impossible to answer that question. I mean, in the sense that, you remember when all your grandparents used to say, oh, it wasn't like this when I was young.
Yes.
Now, for my children, my youngest children, for example, my daughter Bella and Lily, not Amy and Amber, who are a slightly different age, this is their reference point for what is normal. It's not the 1970s and the 1980s. This is it. They live in Dubai. They don't see police. They see a lot of security. You can leave everything you want. Everything works in every function. And when you go into another country, they say, what kind of a place is this? Is this what airports look like when you go back to Heathrow or to some other place? So the question is really, what's your reference point for what is normal? There's no doubt that we have greater access to achieve many more things than at any point in human history. I think that's absolutely true. Have we created problems with those solutions? We certainly have. Will we overcome them? I don't know. We're certainly aware of them, and perhaps we will get close to doing it. But I would say that you are still you. If you're happy, relatively content, if you're able to service those around you, that's probably a good thing. You have more tools now than perhaps you did. I don't know.
Indeed. My final question is that you are indeed a voice of the future, and you've given us so much insight and perspective today. But if you were to write a letter and put it in a bottle, and we find the bottle in, say, 7 to 10 years from now, what would that letter say? What would that message be for the people just picking it up, their reality in their time zone?
Always profoundly difficult questions with you, which is good. I would say, and I think it's been echoed by other people, and I think about myself. There's who I am, me as a person, and then working in the diplomatic space, there's how that transacts itself in the institutional machine. There is no greater freedom than being honest and natural with yourself, being exactly who the person you are. And so I guess, if there was a calling for anything in future generations, is for people to be deeply honest about what they see, and to be outspoken about it, because the voice that you have is important.
Yeah.
Most people you'll see, they do not use their voice. And now what's going on in the divisions in the world, people may want to vote a certain way, but they don't want to say they did.
Yes.
And if they did, they would lose friends. What is that? This is terrible. So I don't know. I think greater respect everybody, not for everything, but go in with just respecting everybody, and encouraging people to be naturally honest and outspoken about the world they see is the only route we have of getting it better. I'm not sure that's actually a direct answer to your question, but
it's philosophically there, and I think it's important for us to have those messages.
And it would say, P.S. If you're not having fun, you're not doing it right.
Yes.
And I think that is probably true. So life should just definitely be a deeply enjoyable experience. And one thing I've always told my kids is, if there are questions that you can't answer, stop asking those questions.
Or ask new questions.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, there's other questions.
Yes.
There's other questions which might be more appropriate out there.
Yeah.
But stay happy and enjoy the good bits, because there's as much good as there has ever been, I would imagine, in the quantum.
It's a true honor.
No, the honor's mine.
Absolutely. It's a real privilege to be with you. Thank you very much indeed for your time.
I appreciate it.
Generosity,
Dear friend.
friendship.
Absolutely.
And all the wonderful things you're doing in the world. You are making a difference.
Well,
to me,
like yourself, we try.
to me, that is really, really special. Thank you, sir.
You're done.
Appreciate it.
My pleasure.